The auctioneer's gavel had gone quiet, and in that silence you could hear the wind combing through the high pasture, and every man and woman crowded into the barn that morning was looking at one small figure standing beside a rope corral, waiting on her word. Unquote. She was not a large woman, and she had never raised her voice in all the years they had known her, and now the fate of half the county's flocks rested in the plain sentence she was about to speak. A representative of the largest wool conglomerate in 3 provinces stood at her elbow, smiling the way men smile when they believe the numbers are already on their side, and behind him the ranchers who had laughed at her all those years shifted their weight and studied their boots and said nothing at all. She let the silence hold. She had learned that a flock survives the winter not by the loudest of the ewes, but by the ones that stand quiet against the wind. And she had become one of those. What none of them understood, yet standing there in the smell of lanolin and dust, was that the true reckoning had been settled long before this morning. Settled, not by any word she would say, but by the mountain itself, which keeps a longer memory than any breeder's ledger. The verdict had been passed years ago. This gathering was only the reading of it. So to understand what she chose that day, you have to go back to the beginning, to a season when nobody knew her name, and nobody would have crossed the road to learn it. 11 years earlier she had come up the valley road in a borrowed truck, with everything she owned folded into 2 crates and a duffel, and she had bought a property that the whole district agreed was a fool's purchase. It was a stony upland holding of some 340 acres, thin-soiled and steep, with a collapsing shearing shed and a farmhouse whose roof let the stars through in 2 rooms. The land had been let go for a decade, and the price reflected it, but it was still nearly every dollar she had, and she signed the papers knowing that if the first year went wrong, there would be no second one. That would have been folly enough. But the thing that turned mere folly into the district's favorite joke was what came with the land. The previous owner, an old man dead now these 2 winters, had kept the flock of an ancient hill breed that the modern books had written off entirely. A small, hardy sheep the wool journals no longer even listed, called extinct in the standard registers because no commercial operation had run them in 40 years. When the estate was settled, 12 ewes and 1 ram of this forgotten breed remained. Unwanted, uncounted, and she took them for almost nothing because nobody else would have them at any price. 13 head of a breed, the books called dead, on 340 acres of rock. That was the whole of her fortune. The arithmetic of it was cruel and simple, and she did it at the kitchen table by lamplight that first week the way a person counts stones in a river before wading across. 12 ewes. If each threw a single lamb, and every lamb lived, which no flock on earth ever managed, she would have 24 head by summer, and a shorn fleece of the modern high-yield breeds ran 4 to 5 kilograms, while these small hill ewes cut barely 2, and coarse 2 at that, or so the district assured her. The men who ran the big improved flocks down in the valley bottoms sheared 8 kilograms off a single modern ewe and sold it by the truckload. She would have to run her whole ragged dozen for a year to match what one of their sheds produced in a morning. On paper she was ruined before she had unpacked. She sat with that arithmetic a long time, and it did not improve, no matter how she turned it, and there was a night in that first month when she put her head down on the table and let herself understand that she had spent her life's small savings on rock and ghosts. But that same night, going out to check the fold before she slept because she could not sleep, she found the oldest of the ewes standing over a lamb born weeks early and out of season, a thing that should not have happened and should not have lived, a scrap of wet wool no bigger than her 2 hands. The night was bitter. By every rule, the lamb should have been dead by morning. She knelt in the mud and dried it with the hem of her own coat, and the old ewe let her, watching with a steady, unbothered eye. And when the lamb found its feet and its mother's flank and began to nurse, the ewe simply turned her patient face to the dark hills as if to say that this was nothing, that her kind had been doing exactly this, on exactly these slopes, since before anyone thought to write a book about it. Something in the woman steadied. Then the books had called these animals extinct. The books had been standing in a heated office. out here in the cold. The animal did not know she was supposed to be dead, and she went on being alive, and her lamb went on breathing. And that was a kind of answer to the arithmetic that no ledger could hold. Word of her purchase had reached town before she had, and when she went in for feed and fencing wire that second week, she learned exactly what the district thought of her. The men outside the merchant's store looked her over and did not trouble to lower their voices. A woman alone, one of them said, run a hill place alone on ghost cheap. And there was laughter, easy and unmalicious, and all the worse for it. The laughter of people who have decided a thing is settled. The merchant himself was kinder, but no more hopeful, and he sold her the wire on credit with the air of a man doing a charity he expected to write off. It was there, that same morning, that she first met the man who would spend the next 11 years trying to take everything from her. He came out of a clean vehicle in a clean coat, and he introduced himself with a warmth so smooth it felt oiled, an agent of the great wool consortium that was steadily buying up the valley one struggling holding at a time. He had heard, he said, that she had inherited a little trouble along with her land, and the consortium would be glad to take those old animals off her hands purely as a kindness. And he named a figure so low it was an insult dressed as a favor. She looked at the figure. She looked at him. No, thank you, she said, and that was all. And she loaded her wire and drove home, and the men by the store laughed again. And the agent stood watching her truck climb the hill road with an expression that was not quite a smile. That autumn was the loneliest labor of her life. She mended the fold walls, stone by stone, with hands that split and bled and then hardened. She patched the shed roof with salvaged tin. She learned to shear badly at first, nicking the patient ewes who bore it, and she carried water up the steep ground when the old trough line cracked, and she counted her 13 head every dusk against the coming of foxes and the wild dogs that worked the ridges. She was so tired some nights she ate standing at the window. And the arithmetic did not improve. She sold her first small clip that season to the co-op buyer, and he weighed it and priced it as coarse hill wool, worth barely a quarter of the improved fleeces, and the check he wrote would not have covered a month of her feed bill. She drove home with it, folded in her pocket like a verdict. She was, by every measure, the valley used, exactly the fool they had named her. It was the old neighbor who turned the season. He lived on the next holding over, an immigrant from a far mountain country who had come to this valley half a century before, and whom the district half respected and half feared for the plainness of his speech. He was very old, and he walked with a staff, and he came up her track one evening uninvited, and he stood at her fold and watched her ewes a long while without saying anything at all, which no one else had ever done. They did not laugh, these animals, at being called dead, he said finally in his slow, careful accent. She asked him what he meant. He said that in his old country there had been sheep, like these, on the high stony ground, and the clever men from the lowland had always said such sheep were worthless because they measured them by the lowland scale, by the weight of the fleece and the speed of the growth. But the mountain does not keep a lowland ledger, he told her. The mountain keeps its own book, and it writes slowly, and it only whispers what it has written, so that a farmer who shouts will never hear it. He set his hand on the wall. You are trying to make these animals into the valley's animals, he said. Stop, let them be the mountains. Then he gave her the practical key, so plain she had missed it. She had been buying feed to fatten them like lowland stock, and it was bleeding her dry. Do not feed them, he said. They were made by hunger and hard ground. Put them on your worst high slopes, the ones nothing else will graze, and let them do the one thing their nature is for, and count not what the fleece weighs, but what it is. And then he went home in the dark, tapping his staff, and left her to think. She did as the old man said, and it changed the arithmetic entirely. She stopped fighting the land. She turned the small flock loose on the steep upper ground that she had thought was useless, the thin acid pasture full of the wiry mountain herbs and heather scrub that the improved breeds would starve on, and the ancient ewes walked out onto it as though they were coming home, which in every deep sense they were. They needed almost no bought feed. They lambed easily and unassisted on the open hill. They shrugged off the wet cold that laid low the pampered valley flocks, and the foxes learned to leave them alone. For the old ram, a broad, quiet beast she had begun to call the elder in her own mind, would put himself between his ewes and any threat with a stillness more frightening than any charge. She stopped carrying water to them. They found the seeps themselves, and the flock that could not survive on paper began, slowly and invisibly, to thrive. That first spring under the old man's method, 11 of her 12 ewes raised lambs, and every lamb lived, and by the end of it she had 23 head, where the book said she should have had ruin. There was a boy in this too. He came from the poorest family down the valley, a silent, watchful child of about 10, whose father drank the little the family had, and he took to walking the long way home past her track, and then to leaning on her wall, and then, without either of them quite deciding it, to helping. He never laughed at her, not once, which set him apart from every adult she had met in the district. He had a gift for the animals. He gave them names, all of them, the whole growing flock, and he knew each one by its face, the way the woman was only slowly learning to. He named the old ram the king, not knowing she had privately named him the elder, and after that she called him the king too, because the boy was right, and it suited him better. The boy asked hard, plain questions. "Why do the men say your sheep are no good?" he asked her once, "when they are the only ones on the whole hill that don't die." She had no answer for that, except the truth, that the men were measuring the wrong thing, and the boy nodded as though this were obvious, which to a child with clear eyes it was. His company was a warmth against the loneliness, and his uncomplicated certainty that her method made sense was, in those thin years, worth more to her than money. And there was in the third year a discovery she kept to herself, the way you bank a coal low under the ash to keep it alive through a long cold night. She had sheared the flock as always, expecting the same coarse clip the co-op buyer sneered at, but she had begun, on the old man's advice, to skirt and sort the fleeces by hand, separating the fine undercoat that grew close to the skin of these hill sheep from the coarse guard hair everyone had always lumped together and condemned. And when she teased that soft inner fiber out and rolled it between her fingers, she felt something the valley's bulk buyers, weighing whole fleeces by the kilogram, had never once bothered to feel. The undercoat of this forgotten breed was extraordinarily fine, finer than the celebrated improved wools, soft as smoke with a luster and a spring to it that she had seen in no other fleece. The books had called the breed worthless, because the books weighed the whole coarse fleece at once and never separated it. But the treasure had been hiding inside the coarseness the entire time, the way the mountain hides its springs under the driest rock. She said nothing to anyone. She kept the sorted fine wool in clean sacks in the mended shed, and she went on letting the district pity her, and she banked the secret and waited, because she did not yet know what it was worth, only that it was worth something, and that a thing guarded is a thing you can choose the moment to reveal. The consortium agent came back. Of course he came back every year, and each year his offer changed shape. In the beginning it was charity, the low insulting figure to take the ghost sheep away. But as her flock quietly grew and her small holding refused to fail, the offers grew too, and their warmth curdled by slow degrees into something else. He offered to buy the whole property at a price that would have let her walk away with a little money and no home, framing it as a rescue. When she declined, he offered a partnership that was plainly a swallowing. He began in the years after that to work the district against her, dropping soft, poisoned words in the merchant's store, that her wool was diseased, that her fences were a danger to the valley flocks, that a woman alone up there was a liability the whole community would end up carrying. He was patient and he was smooth, and he never once raised his voice, and he underestimated her precisely as thoroughly at the end as he had at the beginning, which would prove to be his ruin. Her vindication, when it came, arrived from outside the valley entirely, in the person of a stranger who judged the wool by nothing but its quality. He was a buyer for a fine spinning house in a distant city, a man who dealt in the rarest fibers in the world for people who paid extravagantly for softness, and he had heard a rumor, passed hand to hand among the small mills, of an old hill breed thought extinct, whose undercoat was said to be finer than anything on the market. He drove 4 hours of bad road to reach her, and she brought out her bank sacks of hand-sorted fine wool, and he took a hank of it to the window light and drew it through his fingers, and she watched his professional composure fall away entirely. He measured the fiber with his instruments there on her kitchen table. He was quiet a moment. Then he named a price per kilogram for the fine sorted undercoat. That was not 4 times what the co-op paid for the whole fleece, nor 10 times, but many times beyond that, a figure so far past anything the valley imagined that she had to ask him to say it twice. He bought everything she had. He asked how much more she could produce, and said his house would take every gram of it for years. And when he drove back down the valley road, the men outside the merchant store watched the fine city vehicle come down off the fool's holding, and for the first time in 5 years, none of them laughed. They did not understand yet. But they had begun, faintly, to wonder. She could have grown rich then, quietly and alone, and for 2 more years she nearly did, expanding the flock, selling the fine wool to the city house at prices that would have made the valley men choke, and she kept it all as private as she could, because she had not forgotten how the district had treated her, and she owed them nothing. But you cannot hide a rising thing forever in a small valley. The flock grew, from 13 to 40, to over 160 head of the breed the books had buried, and the old shearing shed was rebuilt sound, and the farmhouse roof no longer let the stars in, and slowly the district's story about her began to strain against the visible facts of her prosperity. The consortium agent saw it too, and his patience began at last to fray, because the very breed he had once tried to buy for pocket change was now the most valuable wool in the region, and he had missed it, and men like him do not forgive themselves for missing a thing. They only try harder to seize it. Then the catastrophe came. The way real catastrophe always comes to that country, not as a storm, but as an absence, a drought that settled over the whole region like the open door of a furnace, left ajar and never closed. It began with the dry autumn that the old hands shrugged at, and then a winter with no snow on the tops, and then a spring in which the rains simply did not arrive, and then a summer of white sky and cracking ground that went on and would not break. The valley bottoms, where the improved flocks grazed the soft irrigated pasture, burned brown in weeks. The great modern breeds, bred for weight and speed and soft living, could not endure it. They needed feed that no longer grew, and water that no longer ran, and the ranchers hauled in fodder at ruinous cost until they could haul no more, and their flocks began to thin and then to die. The consortium's own vast holdings suffered worst of all, for they had stocked the land to its limit in the fat years, and now the land had nothing to give. Down in the store the talk was no longer of a woman alone and her ghost sheep. It was of ruin, real and spreading, and of families who would lose everything by winter. But up on the high stony ground where nothing else would grow, the drought was only another hard season, of the kind that had shaped her breed across 1,000 years. The ancient ewes had been made by exactly this, by hunger and thin ground and scarce water, and they walked the parched slopes cropping the drought-tough mountain herbs that the improved breeds could not even digest, and they found the deep seeps that did not fail, and they went on breathing and lambing and living as though they had been waiting all along for the valley's easy years to end. While the great flocks below thinned and died, her 160 head stood in good flesh on the worst land in the district, and the fine wool grew soft and long on their backs. And she understood, watching them, that the mountain had passed its verdict at last, the verdict it had been writing slowly all these years. The old man had told her it would only whisper. The books had called them extinct. The drought was calling them the only sheep in the valley still alive. It was then that the loud, early mocker came up her track. He was the man who had led the laughter outside the store 11 years before, the most prosperous rancher in the valley bottom, then the loudest voice in every scornful chorus since. Now his fine flock was dying under him, and his fine land was dust. And he came up the hill road on foot because he had sold his good vehicles to buy fodder that had not saved them. And he stood at her wall the way the old neighbor had stood there once, and he could not at first find any words. She waited. Finally, he said plainly that he had come to beg. He had heard her breed was hardy. He had heard she had rams to spare. He wanted to know if she would sell him breeding stock, enough hardy blood to save what remained of his flock, and he confessed that he could not truly pay for it, that he had almost nothing left, and that he had no right to ask her for anything, least of all after the way he had treated her. He waited for her to gouge him. He would have understood it if she had. She looked at the ruin of his pride a long moment, and she remembered the laughter, and then she remembered the lambs she had dried with her coat in the first cold week, and she said only, "Come inside, we'll talk." That was all. So, but it was the beginning of the choice that would end everything. Because the consortium agent had heard it too, that her breed alone had survived, and he understood at last, far too late, what he had failed to buy for pocket change 11 years before. He came to the valley now, not with an offer, but with a plan, and it was the plan of a man who has decided that if he cannot own a thing, he will at least control it. He called a meeting in the largest barn in the district, a gathering of every desperate rancher in the valley, and he stood before them and told them there was a solution to the drought, that the consortium had identified a source of hardy breeding stock and drought-hardened bloodlines that could save their flocks, and that the consortium would purchase this entire source and manage its distribution at a fair price. To all the loyal members of the valley. He did not name her at first, but everyone in that barn knew he meant her 160 head, and they knew he meant to buy her out or force her out, and then meter her animals back to them at whatever price he pleased, holding the whole ruined valley over a barrel of its own desperation. And she was standing at the back of the barn, having come because the boy, grown tall now at 21, had told her she ought to hear what was said about her in her absence. She let him talk. She had learned patience from the Ewes who stood quiet against the wind, and she stood quiet now while he built his case. And it was his own greed that undid him, exactly as the old man might have predicted. For in his eagerness to prove he knew the value of what he meant to seize, the agent grew too precise. He told the assembled ranchers the exact number of breeding age ewes in the source flock, and the exact yield of fine undercoat it produced, and the exact figure the city spinning house paid per kilogram, numbers no one could have known who had not been counting from very close, numbers she had told no living soul but the city buyer and the boy. And in the sudden silence of that barn, she stepped forward into the lamplight, and she said in her plain, quiet voice that carried the way quiet things carry, "You have my flock counted very well for a man who has never once been asked unto my land." The barn went still. She told them simply how he had counted. He could only have those figures, she said, by watching her hill through a glass, season on season, and counting her lambs at a distance the way a fox counts a fold. She let that settle. Then she turned from him to the ranchers, to the man who had come to her wall to beg, to all the faces that had laughed at her for 11 years, and she made her choice. "I will not sell my flock to this man," she said, "not for any price, because he means to sell your own salvation back to you at the point of your need. And I have been at the point of my need in this valley, and I remember who reached out a hand and who did not." But she did not stop there, and it was what she said next that turned the tide of the whole valley in a single breath. She said the breed was never hers to hoard, that the mountain had kept it alive for 1,000 years and had only lent it to her keeping, and that a thing lent must be passed on. She would give breeding rams and in-lamb ewes to every family in the valley that needed them to save their flocks, and she would ask no payment for the animals themselves, not one coin, because you do not sell a gift you were given. She would ask only a fair wage for the labor of raising and delivering and tending them through the change, the plain cost of the work, and nothing on top of it, so that no family need go further into debt to survive. Payment for the labor, she said, never for the gift. The barn was silent, and then it was not silent. The tide turned at an instant, the way it does after long restraint. The man who had come to her wall to beg stood up first, and took off his hat, and said her name, her actual name, which half the district had never once bothered to learn, and thanked her before them all. Then another stood, and another. Hats coming off all down the barn, and the old immigrant neighbor. Very old now and leaning hard on his staff at the side of the room, smiled the small smile of a man watching a thing he had long ago foreseen. And the consortium agent stood alone in the middle of all of it. His plan collapsed under him, exposed as a spy, and undone not by any force, but by simple decency, and he understood that there was nothing left for him in that valley. He gathered his papers. He left the way such men leave in silence and contempt, and no one watched him go because they were all turned toward her. So that was the reckoning. And now you know why the barn had gone so quiet that first morning, and why every soul in it waited on her word, though in truth the word had already been spoken and the choice already made. The rains came at the end of that summer as rains do, breaking against the far tops in a gray wall and rolling up the valley, and the parched ground drank, and the seeps ran full, and the burned pasture greened at last from the roots the drought had not quite killed. Her hardy blood went out into every flock in the district, and the valley's sheep were tougher for it ever after, and the fine wool that the books had called worthless became the one thing that valley grew, that the wide world wanted, and prosperity of a durable, shared kind settled over the high ground and the low. She was no longer the fool on the hill, nor the woman alone. She was the keeper of the breed, a fixture, consulted and respected. Her calloused hands sought at every lambing. The old neighbor came up her track one last time before the winter, and he stood at her wall as he had the first evening, and he watched the flock move across the heeled slope, over 200 head now of a breed the books had buried, and the boy grown to a man working among them, and the king's great-grandson standing broad and quiet against the wind. "You heard it," he said. She asked him what the mountain was whispering. He said, all that time, when they were laughing at you. She said she supposed she had. He nodded, satisfied, and turned to go. "The lowland keeps its ledger and forgets," he said over his shoulder, "but the mountain keeps its own book and remembers, and it only whispers so that the one who listens is the one who is saved." And down on the heeled slope, in the last soft light, a Ewes stood over a new lamb, born out of season, drying it, patient with her breath, as her kind had done on exactly that ground, since long before anyone thought to write them dead, and would go on doing long after all the ledgers were dust.
Là 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 là. Attends, ça, tac, 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 supprimer. Ah, qu'est-ce qui est bien que j'enferme ma fille ou que je joue? Non, que tu joues. Bah non, pas ta fille. Pam padam pam pam. OK. Ah, mais pourquoi ça fait ça? C'est moche. OK, c'est pas grave.